right. Well, salvete omnes, or salvete discipuli, if you prefer to think of yourself as a student, which I hope we all are, students of Latin. So welcome back to the Common Latin podcast. Lee is traveling today, speaking to some groups up in the Pacific Northwest. So I will be your host today. I'm Jennifer Courtney, the Chief Academic Officer for Classical Conversations Multimedia. And we have with us Tim Knotts, who's the Director of Challenge Development, and Kathy Donegia, who's a curriculum developer and the author of Common Latin. And we have a few other team members who are on our academic support team. So Deb is here, and I think Linnell. So welcome, everyone. Believe it or not, here we are on August 5th. I'm assuming some of you are starting community pretty soon. And we are here at the beginning of the academic year, finishing up our tasks in the Common Latin. So last time we met, we looked at task 5, study syntax. We looked at, we did get someone to mute. There we go, thanks. So last time we took a look at task 5, which is study syntax, and we practiced doing that with our parent and student duo of Tim and Kathy by looking first at the concepts in English and reviewing them, and then working how to read and discuss the syntax page as a family. And so that got us through 5 of our 6 tasks. Today, we're going to talk about parsing and translating verses. And in the very first episode, we talked about the connections between essentials and the Common Latin curriculum. And this is one of those tight connections because in essentials, families learn how to parse by using the quid et quo, either on the trivium table or the sheets that are in the essentials curriculum. So today we're going to look at how did that prepare us for Latin, and how are we going to apply it in Latin? So Kathy, tell us about the 2 words in this task, parsing and translating.
So to parse means to name the part of speech and the attributes of a word. So we do that in essentials when we analyze a sentence, and we might say this is a subject noun or this is a subject pronoun. In Latin, of course, there's a lot more attributes that we would add to that. So it's naming the word, what type of word it is, what's the part of speech, and then what are its attributes. For a noun in Latin, you might name the declension, the gender, the number, and the case. And that's exactly what students have been memorizing in the catechism is what are the attributes of Latin nouns. So it ties right in there. For a verb, we would name its conjugation, its person and number, its tense, its voice, and its mood. So quite a bit more to name when we are parsing out verbs. And the trick to parsing is that once we know what the attributes of a word are, we can discover meaning in relation to the other words around the sentence. So if a noun is, for example, a nominative case noun, it's probably the subject. If we've parsed it out and it's an accusative case noun, it's probably, we can assume it's a direct object, right? So that's gonna help us. Early on in Common Latin, students are only parsing the words that they know in a verse. So they may only parse 2 or 3 or 4 words out of a whole verse. And then as the year progresses, they'll be able to parse more. There will be things they won't know in that sentence. Students, as they grow in their ability, by second year, by a second tour, they'll be able to parse more words. They'll have remembered things from the previous year, and they'll gradually transition into translating. And so I thought maybe, Tim, you could tell us what it means to translate.
Yeah, so I know some of you just hopped over from the Math Map Book Club, and we use that word translate in mathematics too, right? To take something from one place and move it to another place. And I love that mathematical imagery even here in language, because we're taking the ideas of the original and using those words to understand them, and then put them in other words that we can understand in a different language. So we're translating. But the ideas are the things that have to stay the same, and how closely we keep those ideas in the word or in the phrase or in the sentence matters for how we end up translating. But this is really where elocution comes in. Students are beginning to know enough to choose the right word for translating and not just a word for translating. So, again, we've all encountered this in church context where the pastor says, oh, and the Bible says love here. Well, we probably know that there's more than one word in Greek for love, and which word is it tells us a little bit about how we understand it even in English. So parsing is the way that we sort of pick it apart and help ourselves understand what the original is, and then translating is how we take that and decide what the right new word is. And it tells us really a lot about meaning instead of just being, which is what parsing tells us a lot about, the parts and the wholes.
Yeah, I love that. So when we talk about that too, over in the exposition strand, we often say your first job is to say what does the text say? That's what parsing is. What do those words say? And based on their endings, we can identify that. And then the second question we ask when we're reading a text in literature or debate is to ask, what does it mean? And that's where the translation comes in, right? Even in our own language, sometimes we have to translate the meaning. So I love those connections. It's also going to be fun for families to think about. You've gotten a start on this task, as I mentioned, with quid et quo. But a lot of the work you have to do in English is done on the verbs because we've dropped some of the cases and the endings from our nouns. We've retained them a little bit more in pronouns, and then we've retained a lot more with the verbs. So this will be the next layer to kind of take the skills that you learned in Essentials and apply it to all the different parts of speech. So in the introduction, Kathy, you said that the road to translation is not without twisting turns, steep climbs, and stones to avoid, but the student who has worked diligently in the previous 5 tasks will be well fitted for the journey. And I loved that idea. We talk a lot about journey metaphors, don't we? And how do we prepare for the journey and move along in the journey? And that's such a great picture that these tasks are all connected. They're connected to one another. This just didn't come out of nowhere, right? We started this work when we memorized vocabulary and when we practiced our catechism rules and when we copied our charts. All of those things prepare us for that task of quid et quo. And I just want to emphasize again that because we have these tasks and skills we're practicing, that means that as a family, you move back and forth. So you might get a student who becomes pretty fluent in Latin by their 5th tour. Or in my case, when I was testing it with my students, I had a student who got there in her 2nd tour through Common Latin. But then what happens is occasionally she would leap to conclusions and we'd have to back up and parse again. We'd have to back up out of the translation task and parse because she would identify something as a noun when it was an adjective, or she would not quite be able to figure out the translation. It's because she didn't quite have the usage of that word correct. And so again, we're emphasizing through our Common Latin curriculum and our community that you're moving back and forth, just like you would move ahead sometimes in math, and sometimes you have to back up and hammer something back in. That's true here too, that you move back and forth between parsing and translating. So like I said, we've given them the vocabulary, the forms, the catechism rules, and the syntax. And so now when we get to task 6, we've really prepared them. So Kathy, I know one of the skills that we use a lot here in task 6 is comparison. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, so comparison is when we explore similarities and then explore differences. And I think whenever we're dealing with language, especially, we do it everywhere, but especially with language, we do a lot of comparison. I think it's just so powerful, especially with Latin. So if you think of like the metaphor of, say, a gardener comparing varieties of tomatoes or varieties of plants, and what makes one distinct from the other and what makes them belong to a particular group and what makes them different. And that's how that comparison is how students of language learn too. So in our own language, we might define a particular word based on what we know of similar words, of synonyms or antonyms or other things or context. So we're doing comparison there. How is this word like another word? Latin students ask the same questions. What can I compare this to in English? And then we also do it with whole verses. So we're comparing a whole verse of Latin to a whole verse of English and seeing what more we can discover by doing that. Maybe how is the word order different in these? How are these particular words used? So lots of different ways to use comparison, I think.
Yeah, I love that. And that takes us all the way back to episode 1, where we talked about Nathaniel Bowditch, who compared his Latin and English New Testament. And there's more on that in the Common Latin Introduction. But that's how he, built his own lexicon and learned the language, was through comparison. And I know, Kathy, that in addition to Mr. Bowditch, or Bowditch, if you say it that way, it's okay. I know that you have another story to tell us today about language and comparison. So tell us about the Rosetta Stone.
Yeah, I do. When my kids were young, we used to love studying about ancient Egypt, and we read the story of the Rosetta Stone and how the hieroglyphs, is it hieroglyphs or hieroglyphics? I forget. But nobody could translate them until I think it was the late 1700s or so. A big stone was discovered it was discovered in Rosetta, Egypt, and it contained the same passage written in 3 different languages. One of those languages was hieroglyphs. And so by comparing the unknown language to what they knew was the other 2 known languages, the linguists finally unlocked the meaning of the hieroglyphics. And it was a written language that had been silent for just centuries. And we just thought that story was fascinating. Later on, a couple of my kids and I got to visit the British Museum in England, and we saw the Rosetta Stone. It was so exciting. But in Common Latin, the students are going to do this every day. They're going to look at Latin, and they're not going to understand everything in that verse, but then they're going to compare it to something that's very familiar with them. Some of the verses they already have memorized, or it's written right there, and they can compare. So that side by side is super, super helpful. And Tim, maybe you can add on to what I was saying about the parallel.
Yeah, I think especially for someone like me, where I'm a casual Latin student, I get to play with it, but I don't have the structured time the way that my kids do when they're working through it with their mom and at home and in community. It's really powerful to be able to sit down with them and sit down with the parallel reading to look to see what can be seen. Because there are cognates. There's lots of words that I know in English, right? Vocabulary with roots that I'm familiar with, where I can point those out and draw them into those conversations, where we can discover some things where maybe there was a different word even that I know in English that I look at the Latin and say, well, why didn't that translate this way? Because it looks like it should. And my students sometimes roll their eyes and explain to me patiently, or not quite so patiently, why I'm off base. But that's great because they're doing the hard work to know more than I know. But I can ask the right kinds of questions, and I'm learning things from looking at the 2 things side by side. And also, there are times where, like Jennifer was saying, I'll be able to sort of piecemeal together, cobble together a rudimentary understanding of a verse based on what I know of Latin and some English cognates, and then I look at the Latin and say, but I don't see that, or or maybe I happen to know the verse, right? I know it in English, and so I can sort of look for what I expect to see, and then it might look different in the Latin. And then it becomes a little bit of a puzzle to see, well, what is different, or why is it different, or what is that order that threw me off? And I really love that because part of the struggle that we've had with our Henley studies a lot is the one-to-one going from Latin to English and having the answer key. And my kids, like most, fall into the trap of thinking that Henley gave them the answer. And instead of looking at it as I solved my math problem one-to-one, instead looking at it as a puzzle to solve where there's maybe multiple ways to answer it, is a really beautiful and powerful way to approach this language study.
Yeah, I love that. And you guys have both reminded me of an exercise I did way back a long time ago when I was in school. I was in a special seminar, and we had to make up our own language and leave an archaeological piece of evidence that was the key to this language, like the Rosetta Stone. And then the teams we were on swapped, of course, and unearthed each other's artifact and tried to do the language. And we did exactly what we've been describing here. We had to attend to it and look for patterns and compare to things that we might know and notice repetitions. And so we've talked about some of those skills and how we build them. We've talked about attending and how we need to focus all of our attention. So one of the things, if you were a young Nat Bowditch, that you were doing as you were reading the Vulgate and comparing is even before you have, he didn't have charts like we're giving our kids, but he's probably able to go, every time something seems like it should be in the past tense, a lot of times there is a V or an X in the stem of that verb. And so you can start to intuit those patterns just by attending. And then when you add that layer of memorizing and you're comparing, you have this powerful combination of, a few words and ideas, and then you attend, memorize, and compare, and you gain more ideas, and you hammer them in and retain them. So I love thinking about how our skills weave together to help families do these tasks well. So, Kathy, I think you mentioned this earlier, but when we're looking at these tasks, they don't look the same when we have a student who's a Tour 1 student and a Tour 5 student. That's true of all 6 tasks, but particularly I think it's important to emphasize here with task 6 that your Tour 1 student and your Tour 5 student are going to be in a different place. So talk to us about what happens in those first tours.
Yeah, we were very intentional because we're dealing with actual Latin that was written over 1,000 years ago. There are going to be things that many students and parents won't know in the verses. It's really important that we understand that with tours 1 and 2, and these would typically be your challenge A or B students, but it could be a challenge 1 or 2 or 3 student who is entering for the first time. They would be a tour 1 student. What we ask them to do in this task 6 is first to copy the Latin. That helps them attend well to every word. Then copy the English, just copy it out as a verse. I'll show you how to do that in a minute. So you're already thinking about what the words are. You're thinking about the English verse. You're kind of maybe imagining how some of that might go together. And then parse the words you know. And for some verses, a student may only know 2 or 3 words or 4 or 5 words. That will grow as they move through the tours. And then finally, compare the Latin to the English and see what else you can match up. See if you can find any other words and find their meanings in the English. See if you can, or if there's a word that interests you that you maybe even want to add to your vocabulary because it seems like a really fun word. So that's tours 1 and 2. In tour 3, well, Tim, why don't you talk about tour 3?
Yeah, I love Tour 3. Thanks, Kathy.
I know.
Tour 3 is awesome because it's the tour where most of our students, the light bulbs are really starting to turn on about some things. And so you'll see, right, that the listing here isn't really a lot different from tours 1 and 2, except for there's one word in the middle that might rub you a little the wrong way. And if you put it in front of your kid, it might rub them the wrong way too, which is that word attempt. Attempt a translation. And we might read that and think, oh, that's presuming that they're going to fail at this task. And chances are they probably will, because they don't know enough yet, right? They haven't done this enough times. They don't have enough vocabulary. Their syntax is still spotty and they're putting it together. And that's okay, because we're not really asking them to be proficient at translation yet. They're just making first steps toward translation. They're starting to put together things and see what they recognize. They're starting to assemble that syntax tool belt that they're being equipped with. And I think that gives even more delight when they find things that they recognize in syntax than it does when they see words that they recognize. Right? Vocabulary is sort of the low-hanging fruit, and by the time they've done a couple of tours of picking up the low-hanging fruit, they're like, yeah, okay, good. I can find Latin words that I know. But when you start to ask them to do this, and something clicks, and they get something right in recognizing the direct object of the sentence and getting a clause or a phrase identified correctly, that's like self-feeding, right? Enjoyment. They start to see that, and that's really exciting for them. But also you have to restrain that expectation of, if you give them a whole verse, that they're going to be able to do all of it all right all the time. They're not likely to do that unless you give them a really simple verse that you've sort of cultivated carefully for them that focuses on what they do know. But if you give them one from the wild, there are verses from the wild. They're not carefully curated, packaged deals that are set up for them to be successful at. they're thorny, and sometimes we're not altogether sure why Jerome picked the way that he picked to structure that sentence, or why the translators of our parallel reading Dreams chose their translation into English. And so there's always a point of comparison, even if they're getting it mostly right. There's room for those conversations. But 2 or 3 is really cool because those lights are coming on, and we want to push them ahead away from just recognizing the words and into that realm of translating.
That's a really good way to put it, that they're attempting a translation, but they're not expected to be able to translate the whole thing. And it makes it just so fun because then they'll figure out something, or even through comparison, figure out something new. And I agree, Tim. I think that's one of the best years. Tours 4 and 5, this is where they're pushing into more and more actual translating. So we ask them to copy or read the Latin. Sometimes they can just read it and translate. Then translate, do the best they can and translate as much as they're able to. And then return to parsing when they hit a wall, when they hit a stuck, when there's a word they don't know, when there's a phrase or a construction they don't know. That's when they would need to start parsing. And they're learning things like subordinate clauses then, and how does this verb tense work with the main verb tense. And so parsing can really help them out with some of that. And then they use the English translation to verify how does their translation then compare to what the Douay-Rheims translation was, and what did I do differently? And maybe did I really get this wrong, or did I just elocute it differently?
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I want to pull out a few things because Tim said something important about the Vulgate being a whole text. It's not curated. So just going back to essentials again, because the children are young when we have them in essentials, we wrote sentences, especially for tour 1 of essentials, that were black and white, very clear for practicing whatever sentence pattern or structure we told them. We artificially made sentences that have those concepts and only those concepts. But as we know, that's not how real language works. Even when our children are very small, they speak in complex syntax. And so when we're giving them, now they're a little bit older, we're not curating the sentences, we're giving them an actual text. And so it's really important for us to exercise patience and say, you know what? I might only know 3 words in that sentence, and that's okay. And then I'm going to grow, and I'm going to return to it, and I'm going to grow. And so I just want to encourage you in that. I also want to encourage you in the fact that you see across all the tours, we say copy the Latin or read it. This is so fundamental. I have been studying Latin now for about 20 years, maybe a little more. And I still am copying Latin. So when I take my Latin Vulgate to church every week, the first thing I do is copy the verses in Latin that my pastor is about to preach the sermon on before I try to figure out what they mean. And I also practice exactly what we're saying to the students here. First, I copy, then I compare, because I'm listening while he's reading it in English and I'm reading it in my Vulgate. So I'm comparing. And then I attempt to translate. And I am still, sometimes if it's a familiar narrative from John, because I've been teaching Common Latin, then I don't have to look any words up or parse any words. However, what happens to me when we get into Hebrews and we have abstract concepts and words that are rarer, I have to back up in my skills to my dictionary, to looking up words that I don't have memorized, to parsing them, to try to put it together. Then I compare again and say, I don't understand how that's fitting together in the Latin when the syntax is different. So we want to just keep practicing as families these skills. And that's one exciting thing about the unity of how we can do it together is all of us around the table can look at the same verse, but we're all going to be in very different places in our understanding. So we help encourage one another in the family to back up. So I don't want to neglect that copying. That's a very important part of learning any language, your own or another one. And then, like I said, we use our skills. We attend as we're copying, we compare, and then we try. As Tim said, I appreciated that. We attempt. You know, I think about this all the time because I've taught writing for a lot of years now. And that's what the word essay means. It means to try to articulate your thoughts for someone else. That is probably the most important verb that I can think of in education. Try, and then try again. And be patient and sometimes wait for understanding. So that's why we're going to practice, whether we're in tour 1 or 5, we're practicing these 6 tasks and our 15 skills over and over again. So with that in mind, Kathy, we do have a tool for students to use, because we can't just leave them with skills and tasks. We need a tool to help us do the tasks. So talk to us about the Quid et Quo tool that we have.
Yeah, and you've already mentioned the Quid et Quo. They do a Quid et Quo in Essentials, and so the Latin Quid et Quo looks a little bit different, because what we're going to do with that, it's actually a full page. I just have the top of a blank sheet here. What we're asking the students to do, so if you're if you're in any tour, you can use this tool. The gray line is where you would write the Latin verse out. So this is just the beginning of John 3:16, which is the verse we've been working with. So you put one word per cell. And then the next thing you would do is in this blank place below, you would write the English. Okay, so we have the Latin and we have the English. And then you would go through, and I'm going to do this with Tim in a minute. Then you would go through and you would parse and translate the words that you know. So we've been working with Deus a lot in these last 6 book clubs. And so I would just parse Deus out. I like to put the parsing on the top and then the meaning of the word right below it. You may have done that differently in the past. That's just what I like, and it's how I set up the Quid et Quo with the big blank space. So Deus is a second declension noun. It's a noun. It's second declension. I know it's second declension because the vocabulary is Deus, Dei, and so the I in that genitive tells me it's second declension. I've memorized that it's masculine and it's singular, and this is the nominative form. And I can verify that that's nominative because the verse is for God so loved. So who is doing the loving? God. He's the subject of the sentence. So I thought what we would do then is, I guess we could put this into practice, right, Jennifer, with Tim?
Yes. Tim, are you game for being the student again?
Yes.
You're good to go? Okay.
Yes. So I've added a little more. Okay, so I've added a little more of the verse. For God so loved the world as to give his only begotten son, and you can see it there in Latin. We've actually been parsing a little bit of this verse out as we've gone through the other 6 tasks or the other 5 tasks. Typically, you don't have to do that during those. Like if you're reciting the catechism, you're not going to jump over to the verse like we were doing in the book clubs. We only did that to show you where you're headed. And now we finally arrived in this book club with task 6, where we've been heading this whole time. So Tim, just like I parsed Deus, the next word in this sentence that you probably will recognize is mundum. You recognize that one? What can you tell me about that?
I remember mundum. I remember that it is the word for world, and that it is a masculine noun.
Okay.
I also remember from our catechism of a few weeks back that our Latin nouns have 4 attributes. So as we parse, we're looking to describe those 4 attributes. One of them is gender, so I know it's masculine. We got that. Declension, number, and case are the other 3. And as I recall from a past, right, we had our filius, filium, mundum, right, is masculine, second declension, singular because it's one world. And here it is mundum tells us it's an accusative case, right? Direct object.
Yes, I think you hit everything. And does it make sense that as you see the English, does it make sense that would be the direct object if you asked God loved who or God loved what? Yeah, good. Okay, so the next word we see that we've been dealing with is filium. So can you do the same for filium?
Yeah, so thankfully it's a lot alike mundum, so that makes it happy and easy for me. Also second declension, also masculine, also accusative, also singular. So it parses out exactly the same way, and it's the word for son.
Yeah, very good, very good. This is not a verse from lesson 3, but this is right around lesson 3, for a Tour 1 student. So they will have learned something about the linking verbs, whom. They would have learned some first declension nouns and some second declension nouns. And we've been, working with second declension nouns a lot in our book club so far. So just to give you an idea of how many words in just this little portion of a verse a student might know. This would be a Tour 1 student. Now, a Tour 2 student would probably know a few more words, right? They would know maybe suum. They might know dilexit. So a few other things.
Yeah. And then those later tour students are going to learn ut, since that's our subordinating conjunction there. They're going to see lots of those as they get into the upper tours. Yeah. So I hope this helps reinforce a few things we talked about here in our first few book clubs. One is that notice how Tim pulled out the knowledge from the catechism in order to complete the current task. So that's a place where, as the parent, you might need to prompt them sometimes. Well, you told me that God is a noun. Now, what are the attributes of Latin nouns? And just you knowing that question as the parent means the student can pull that information out. So if Tim hadn't remembered, that's how I suspect Kathy would have handled it, was to kind of give a little clue to prompt the catechism question that helps you answer that. And then notice how what we talked about today. So Tim was attending to word endings in his vocabulary list that he had memorized, and also doing some comparison. Because remember, it seemed like he knew the word filius, filii. That was his strongest memory. And so he used that to compare and make sense of mundus, mundi. And so all those skills are coming into play in that demonstration. So Kathy, you said you pulled just a part of the verse for us to look at. Are you ready now for us to look at the whole thing?
Yeah, I thought we'd look at the whole thing. Now, I did not put the whole verse on a quid quo because then the page would be so small, it would be hard to see. So we're just going to parse a few things in here, or take a look and do some comparisons here as we need to. And so this is the verse in Latin: Sic enim Deus dilexit mundum, ut filium suum unigenitum daret, ut omnes qui credit in eum non periat, sed habeat vitam aeternam. And of course, we know that that is, for God so loved the world as to give his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him may not perish, but may have life everlasting. So what I wanted to ask you, maybe I'll ask Tim first, is now that you see the whole verse and you see the English beside it, do you notice anything, or what do you notice as you compare the two?
There's still other words in here that I recognize that if I was a student, I might pursue more of, or be able to fill in because I know them in English, or they're close enough in English. Like aeternam is very familiar. And it would also, because I'm a little bit of a etymology nerd, I would want to know why the A-E says A and then I and then becomes E in English, and right, eternal. So that certainly, and at the beginning, at the other end of the sentence, seek is one I know from seek semper tyrannis, right? Thus always tyrants. But in that it's translated thus, and here it's translated for. So that makes me scratch my head and want to know a little bit more about that word too.
That's an interesting word in this verse, isn't it? Because this John 3:16, of course, follows John 3:15. So we should probably go back to John 3:15 and say, why did Jerome feel the need to say thus, or and so, and as follows? And because then anum is actually the word that means the for. So could this verse have made as much sense without the sick there? But he's continuing on from a previous passage, which makes it super interesting, doesn't it?
Yeah, I always tell my students too, that's one of the things you have to attend to. If your verse contains a connecting word like that, like sick, you better go find what came before, or you're not going to be able to make good sense. Because sometimes our verses break up a thought. They often do that. Our verse numbering system will break up the thought. And the other one is, of course, with pronouns. You better go find out who's the antecedent to this pronoun. There are lots of pronouns in scripture. You better know who the him means. So I liked looking at this. Oh, go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, I was going to say also, I mean, that's one of the things I do love about this, that we're giving them the whole chapter of Scripture, the whole book of Scripture to look at, that it's not just here's a verse to translate, but they can go look in the parallel reading right next door and see what is there in front of it, or what does come next.
Yeah, that's really good. One of the things that we attend to and do with the students in Essentials is to find the independent clauses and the subordinate clauses. And one of the ways we can teach even young students to break sentences into phrases and clauses is that we use commas to indicate this. Now, we've punctuated here. So we have this first phrase, sic enim Deus delexit mundum. And so that's our first clause. And if you notice, it's God loved the world, just like we have it in English. Deus is God, delexit is loved, and mundum is world. But when you get into the next clause, and this, he gave his only begotten son, the verb is daret. It's at the end. So it really says, and son, his only, he gave. Well, that's weird to us. So as we start comparing, we sort of get a sense that that's actually more common in Latin to have the verb be at the end of the clause than it is to have it the way it is in that first part of the sentence. So that's one comparison. And then I was noticing that we have vitam aeternam, so life everlasting, and they chose, or life eternal, and the Douay Rheims translators kept it in that order. In English, we tend to put the adjective before the word. But in Latin and the other Romance languages, qualitative adjectives like that always follow their noun. And so that was interesting to me that the translator could have said, but may have everlasting life. That's probably how we memorized it when we were in Sunday school. But the Douay Rheims kept it much stricter to the Latin here by saying life and then everlasting. So that was a fun comparison. I probably went on too long, Kathy. So talk to us about what upper tour students would do when looking at this.
Yeah, I actually thought it was really fun to listen to all the different things that you were finding in here. There's so much to see. Well, I would say, first of all, that a tour 1 or 2 family would probably stop before some of the things we just said. Some of it they might find interesting, but some of it may just be like looking at the subordinate clauses might be too much, although they could do that in English. But then as the students move into tour 3, they may know this verse well enough that they can just translate it, or maybe they don't know the reference yet and they're just reading the verse. They might see God loved the world. They would recognize delexit because they would have had that in tour 1. They might not know what ut means, but they would see filium suum and see his son. They would see probably omnes qui credit in eum and be able to translate that phrase as all who believed in him, and something's going to click and they're going to say, wait a minute, I know this verse. I think I can translate a lot of this. And so then they can start matching up even more phrases and things. They'll know probably at least 2 of the verbs in this phrase. They would, a tour 2 student even would. They would be confused with daret because that's a construction that they would not have had yet. They'll be saying, well, it's the word give. It does kind of look like the word give, but that's a really odd form of it. And so that's because it's a subjunctive, and they wouldn't get that till tour 3. But a tour 3 student would be getting to that soon enough that they could figure some of that out. They've had a couple of years of Latin under their belt. They're going to know more words. They're going to be curious about some other things. And then a tour 4 or 5 student, of course, is going to start with just the Latin verse, try to read through, try to mark it and translate what they can, copy the verse down, see how much they can translate, and then parse what they need to try to figure it out. Like why is the verb daret in the form that it's in? And that has to do with the form that the main verb is in. One of the things I like to do as a Latin student is I don't actually use the quid et quo, because I've done like 20 years of Latin also, but I will write the verse out and I'll skip lines in between. And that gives me space to parse and to write translations. And I do things like I'll bracket the clauses to get them, separate them, or I'll put parentheses around the prepositional phrases. I'll underline verbs twice so that I can find all the verbs in the verse. So that's the kind of thing a 2 or 4 or 5 student would probably be doing as they work through trying to translate the verse.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I wanted to share real quick, Kathy, and
Yeah.
hopefully I won't sidetrack you too much, but
Okay.
as you were talking, I also remembered the first time I did this with students, so I would consider them to be tour one. Two things stood out about that conversation with this verse. One of them goes, "Hey, how come the word credit is in here?" So that little hilarious exclamation allowed us to have a good conversation about the connection between credit and belief and what does that mean. And so that stuck the word in a little better. I always love it when students do that. And then the other one said, "Hey, how come son is capitalized here?" And also fun because, of course, it's probably capitalized in the English Bible that they've been using all their lives. But because this verse is familiar, they no longer attend to it. And so it being capitalized in the Latin made them go, "Oh, that's a proper noun." It isn't normally a proper noun. It's normally a common noun. And so it was fun to have those tour one revelations.
Yeah, that's super. That's super. You've already gone over a lot of the things that we've noticed. Did you notice anything else as Tim and I went through it, or as we talked about those upper tours? Just about the pedagogy of what we did.
I loved how Tim spontaneously pulled you lived up to what we said. You pulled in your vocabulary words, you pulled in your catechism questions, your chart work from all the previous tasks, and just pulled it in and showed exactly what will happen when you do the quid et quo as a conversation. And that's one thing we probably haven't harped on that I would like to emphasize, Kathy, is that you guys have demonstrated really well over these last few book clubs how the tasks are conversational around the table. And you asked him a couple of questions. What else do you recognize is a very powerful question to ask? And if they don't recognize any others, well, what other words look like this one is kind of your next question, so that they can, if the student is slow to compare. And I just loved watching you guys do that so naturally in conversation and weaving together. So
good. I thought we'd talk a little bit next maybe about just the art of translation before we end with questions.
Yeah, that sounds great.
What you know.
And Tim kind of hit on one of the points that I always share with students. I can't tell you how many times over the years a student would bring me their translated sentence from Henley and the answer key and say, "Oh, I got this wrong." And I was like, "Well, did you? I don't know. Let's talk about the shades of meaning for that word. Is your translation truly wrong? Or did you just interpret it with a different shade of meaning? And if you did interpret it with a different shade of meaning, is that one acceptable?" It might be. We mean lots of different things by the words. And so that's one thing we want to emphasize, is that it's an art. So when it's fine to have a solutions manual. And here we have the answer key is the English translation. We can always refer to it, but those are choices that the Douay-Rheims translators made. And sometimes we would argue for a different translation, and that's why it is an art. And you've put that really well here in the introduction, Kathy, that it involves making choices so that ideas are conveyed accurately and beautifully. I think I've told you guys this, but when you go to the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C., you can take a quiz to ascertain what kind of translator you would be. And you can learn if you are more of the word for word, whether you lean to the accuracy side or whether you like to make it more poetic and analogical. You can learn this about yourself by taking this quiz. So we try to get as accurate as we can. Right? What does the text say? We talked about that at the beginning. That's question one. What does it actually say? But also sometimes it's beautiful. We have all kinds of stylistic devices in English, and they had those at their command in Latin as well. And so those are choices that all translators make to alliterate words or rhyme them or put them in a different order for emphasis. Those are all translation choices. So you want to talk more about that, Tim? I know you love the elocution.
I do. I love beautiful words. And so one of the words that's in this verse that has me wondering is, because, again, I'm a rudimentary Latin student, one of the Latin words that I do know is amo, right? Love. And so then that gets me wondering why this word delexi is here instead of amo, because that would be, if I was going to translate it from the English, for God so loved the world, and I'm picking from my limited Latin vocabulary, I would have plugged amo in there. And so I went and looked up because I wanted to know what's the connotation and denotation of delexi. And it's fun because it's you can also get down into those etymological roots, which is wonderful, right? And it is to take aside for oneself, or to highly cherish something, to esteem it greatly. I'm like, wow, that's really cool. There's a lot of layers of meaning there that are just so different from love of the sort of romantic kind that we would attach more often to that amo word. And I think does a beautiful job of showing us how God maybe views the world that's a little differently than just throwing any old word for love in there. He picked that one. So maybe if I were translating this, I would pick something a little different than love. I might write highly esteemed or cherished, or picked for himself, right? Because that's sort of the etymological root of it. And of course, I have to be guided by history and tradition in understanding it. But picking it for translation purposes, I can pick what's beautiful and conveys that idea.
Yeah, I love how you added to that, because I think way back, maybe in one of the earlier book clubs, we talked about the connection between that word and diligence. And so you've just added another layer by saying highly esteemed or choosing for oneself, which is connected to that idea of diligence and setting your attention, fixing your attention on someone. So I love that. Yeah. So I appreciate that you pulled out, the very first baby chant that Latin students have learned since Latin was a thing is amo amasamat, amam samat samant. It's in every movie where there's Latin learning going on. And so I love that you made that connection, that there are many words that mean love, and getting that. So that's why it is that lifelong journey of looking at the words and getting a deeper understanding and choosing beautifully. And eventually we get to appreciate the choices that Jerome made. At first, we're just puzzling them out and trying to figure out what he said. And then later we can look at it as we grow in our maturity and say, wow, that was a really interesting choice, or a really beautiful choice, or a memorable choice. So that's great. And that's really when we get, again, we don't want to neglect the simple things that get us there, right? It's these tasks and the other things we talked about today, like copying. It's the copying, it's the chanting the catechism, it's the memorizing your vocabulary, it's the knowing the forms that eventually gets you to that fruit of really looking at the beauty of the language. But every day we practice a little bit toward that. We don't expect to have the glorious light bulb moment every day. First, we just practice our skills and try to get more and more accurate. So did you have anything to add, Kathy?
I don't think so. You guys covered it so well. I'm looking at the time too, and I think we probably need to go to Q&A next. Do you think so? Yeah. Good. So we're just open to any of your questions now. And you can put questions in the chat, or you can put them, you can just come on mic and ask.
I have a question.
Okay.
And it's an obvious answer. I mean, I think I already know the answer. I just want a little bit of like verbal or affirmation. So if you look at tours 1 through 2, the parse words that you know. So like when we did the quid et quo, like we only did like a couple of nouns and we just left it. And then we moved on to comparing. Yeah. So there.
Yes.
So that feels like weird just to do a little bit, but that's exactly what you're asking us to do.
That is exactly what we're asking you to do, because you don't have the skills. A Tour 1 student does not have the vocabulary or the syntax or the skills yet to parse every word in this verse. If you were doing Henley Latin, they have given you a limited vocabulary, and the sentences that they give you only include that vocabulary and only include the grammar constructions and the charts that they've taught you so far. And so you can parse a whole verse and translate, or a whole sentence, because they've graded them down. They've created these easy sentence. Well, they don't always feel easy, right? But they've created these sentences that are only cover what you've been told. And this is very different. It's a full text. And so as a parent, let's say you're just randomly picking verses for your student to parse through, there actually might not be anything they know in some of those verses. If they're a first or second year student, it's likely that there will be something, though. And then they'll learn more from comparison. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I cut you off, Kathy.
No, go ahead.
As the parent, you have a roadmap for that Tour 1 student, because you've got the what do they know mapped out in the table of contents, the scope and sequence. So you would know that on this week, pretty much all they're going to do is pick out some nouns that are either in first or second declension. That's all they know. And so that's what if they can't find any words they know, then you can look for some that might have been on their vocabulary list, and maybe they just didn't realize that they knew them. But also the other thing you can do if you're all stumped as a family is just say, great, pick a word and let's look it up in the dictionary and get started. We'll just try to figure out what it is by using our dictionary and practice. So you can either use the scope and sequence, the table of contents to know what should they know and prompt them that way. Or you can just take the dictionary and have a serendipitous moment of learning some Latin that day.
You can also treat this a little bit like a Sudoku game, right? Where you write in with boldness the things that you do know, and then maybe you lightly pencil in some guesses about some other words that you think maybe you can figure out or you might recognize. Like here, suum is probably beyond me exactly what it is, but it does look a lot like sum, and it has a ending like filium, so maybe it has something to do with that, right? So I might write in a few guesses, just little guesswork, and then later I can come back and check and see, did I get some things right? So don't limit it and say only do the things you know all of, but play with some of the other things too and see how far you can get.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Tim, because on the Quid et Quo, sometimes even in Essentials, people get, and we do offer solutions in Essentials, and you won't quite have that same solutions manual here because it's the whole Bible. it's whole books of the Bible. But we sometimes unnecessarily get hung up on filling in all the blanks. Remember that this is toward that art of translation. It's a movement toward. And so the purpose of parsing is not to get more and more accurate at parsing. The purpose is to get more and more accurate at translating. So sorry, Kathy, I cut you off again.
I know. And now I forget what I was going to say, but that's a super, super good point, that it's moving towards something. It's not the be all end all of parsing. So good. I think there's some questions in the chat box. Let's see. What are some materials we can use now in Challenge A to help move our students smoothly into Common Latin? I would say focus on, I've talked to a lot of people about this lately, and vocabulary is always going to help you. Like you may not see, you won't see all the same words in the Vulgate, but you'll see a lot of similar ones. Charts are hugely important. So if you have, say, a Challenge A student, they're going to be spending most of first semester on nouns and adjectives. They get into some pronouns also. And that's very similar to Common Latin. They'll be going back over those noun charts. And then read through the Henley lessons and just discuss the grammar that you see. We
do have the flashcards, foundations level flashcards that have some of the Vulgate vocabulary. So if your student is amenable to doing a little extra to be smoothly transitioning, don't neglect your Henley, because that's what they're going to do in community this year. But adding on a few extra vocabulary words from the Vulgates to help ease that transition would be a good way to do it too.
That's good.
And you can practice. I mean, this is one thing, I taught Henley for many, many, many years. And so if you are in that boat this year, you can just do exactly what we've been doing here, which is put a Henley sentence or passage on the board. and start having that conversation about what do you recognize and know. So this is giving you the skills to practice. The text is a little bit irrelevant, although we're excited about the Vulgate and moving into studying God's word. The skills can be used on any passage that you put on the board during community.
Yeah, good. I think, Stefan, let's see, Nicole, I think you said your second question about how would we guide a student who is new to CC. Did you get that one answered? I think you said we did. Type it again when you need me to. Let's see. Stephanie says, I really appreciate how the steps for the different tours will allow community as a whole and families at home to have a consistent approach to task 6. Yes, it is consistent. What they're doing in community is the 6 tasks. What they're doing at home is the 6 tasks. I remembered what I was going to say earlier, Jennifer. In the curriculum for every lesson, we do have one sample verse completely parsed out. So parents can use that. And what we've done is we've bolded the parts of that verse that a Tour 1 student should be able to recognize to kind of give the parents some direction and a good example. Let's see. Tutors who have consistent framework to use in community today will allow that unity for the community as a group of students move through the levels, much like how the math map allows that unity. Yeah, I really appreciate the unity that this is going to provide, both within the family and within the community. You come to community and you got stuck on a verse last week, sit around the lunch table and discuss it with the other moms. See what they come up with, and then go on the community forums, the CC Connected forums too. Any chance the Latin Quid quote is in CC Connected for us to use this year? That is a Tim and Jennifer question.
Not this year, but honestly, the Quid et Quo form as it is to remind younger students there's no reason why you can't do it on notebook paper. So I just want to go back to what Kathy said, because I followed the same process as her. I copy the Latin and I leave space above for translating. And then I leave space below for parsing when I get into trouble. Even 20 years in, I still do this. I have those multiple lines. So you can do it easily on a whiteboard or on notebook paper where you parse below. And then you put and usually I put the word by word translation directly above, and you got to have another space for when you put it in the right word order. Because when you put the word by word translation up there, you're still not finished, because it's not going to be something that you could read. So that last step is kind of putting it in the right order.
Yeah.
So
next question is where can we get a whole Vulgate? You can find them online. There are some, and then they're searchable. There are some, if you go to like Internet Archive or some of those, there's some older books that are public domain. You can also purchase a Vulgate, not a parallel, but you can purchase a Vulgate if that's what your desire is. If you want to bring a physical book, say bring a physical book to church like Jennifer does.
Yeah, we've had a couple of people ask about where they might find a complete parallel English Vulgate edition, and they almost don't exist because it's really really fat. I mean, think about how fat a normal Bible is. Plus, then you add your apocryphal books, and then double it for the English. And they pretty much don't exist. And if they did, we probably would just point you to those instead of making our own. But we've given you the books that we have because to purchase, because those are so hard to find otherwise. Yeah.
And just as a truly nerdy nugget, for those of you who really like languages, there is an online Bible called the Hexaglot, which has Hebrew and Greek and Spanish and Latin and English. So if you really want to, obviously they don't print that. It's across in 6 columns so that you can see all 6 of those languages at once. Very fun.
That would be super. Bonnie, let's see. Bonnie is saying she's going to have a challenge 2 and a challenge 1 student next year. Do we have any suggestions for navigating both Henley Latin and Common Latin?
Maybe I think the 6 tasks can still, like Jennifer pointed out earlier, the 6 tasks can still unify what you're doing. They'll be on different lessons, so you won't be able to have the conversation around the same syntax every week. But you can certainly be centered on the same 6 tasks to help structure your day and your studies. And And frankly, using the quid et quo, even with Henley, can be really helpful. My students took the National Latin exam the last couple of years here at home, and probably would have been much better served by having had done some more quid et quo to figure out some of the things that they missed because they made some assumptions in their National Latin exam results rather than sitting down and parsing carefully. But yeah, that would be my suggestion.
I think one of the things that can cause problems when you're doing Henley is you see so many exercises and you end up neglecting your chart work and your rule work and your vocabulary because you're trying to get through, check the box off that I did 20 or 30 exercises. And I think what the 6 tasks do is it helps you balance those important things that need to be done. And so you may not get through as many sentences or as many passages, but I think you're going to learn it better if you apply the 6 tasks to Henley. Let's see, we're almost done here. Sarah says she has a daughter in Challenge A. Her goal is to memorize vocabulary and be able to look at a word and know the case by the ending most of the time. Is number 2 a realistic goal, knowing the case? I think it is. I think practicing charts is super important. So you're gonna practice those charts of endings by copying. And then just like we were showing you with the chart activities, you'll maybe decline first declension or copy the first declension noun endings, chant them, and then decline vocabulary words. And that will cause you, the end result is that as you're looking through passages, you'll be able to recognize those endings more easily because you've seen them, you've copied them, you've applied them to words. So we're a little bit over time. We'll end. Okay.
I think you did get them all.
I think I did.
Keeping track with you. Yep.
So next week, so we've gone through an introduction. We've gone through all the 6 tasks, and next week we will be we're going to go lesson by lesson as a Tour 1 parent. So we'll go through. Next week will be lesson 1, and we'll walk through all the 6 tasks and just get some tips and pointers for how to do lesson 1 with your students. So thank you for coming, Jennifer. If you want to close us out.
All right. Yes. Keep looking at your Latin and be well, students. All right. We'll see you next time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.